All right. Welcome to member speeches. Who intends to speak member in their lifetime? Hands up.
What was the question?
Well, I think, sorry. So BP is actually so small in terms of like 2 people, and you can't really control who you will be with. So I suggest you learn member because it's especially at closing, it's very versatile. People do firsts, but they also do outsides. So which means even if you are traditionally second speaker, member is actually a very good position for you, and I'll explain why as we go through it. So generally will be useful. The other thing I want to say before we start this is member is very versatile, and there are many different approaches to it. So this will be my specific approach to it, and I'm sure others will have their own thoughts on how to do member. So don't take this as like gospel. Figure out what other people do as well and form your own style of doing a member. The second thing is, as usual, and specifically for member as well, you're very reactive, right? So you're reacting to not only the motion at hand and how you've prepped, but what opening has done, and not just your opening, but the other opening as well, where they've clashed, the quality of argumentation and the quality of responses, and how that clash has gone through, which means it's relatively hard for me to be specific about certain things as we get into what extensions look like, and it'll be relatively vague. And in order to ground that, I would like people to think of BP motions and debates that you've done recently, and what cases openings have run when you've been at closing, and feel free to ask those kinds of questions so we can actually work through some examples. Aisha has kindly agreed to give a bad opening speech, as she put it, so that I can demonstrate extending inwards and maybe give you some of the language that you'd use for that meta-analysis. So today we're going to go through some general BP strat stuff, what specifically member should do and what your role is. And I think there's a lot of confusion around this because you are like a speaker that's kind of responsive because you're after opening, but you're also the first person to demonstrate your case. So what that balance looks like. Thirdly, we're going to go, after this, we're going to go through the entire life cycle of a debate, right? So firstly, what do you do in prep? What do you do during opening? So tracking the debate, and then extensions and how do you form your extensions. And afterwards, usually we'll just do some general tips and tricks and questions from the audience. Cool, general BP strats. Firstly, sorry, Melissa, you have a question? Those 2 people represent like what you would get in BP, which is a team of 2, you know?
Yeah. That's quite simple.
How's that?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Cool. So the first thing we know about BP is getting a second is a win. You can get a second in every single round up till the finals, obviously, and then you want to get a first. But the point to note here is that don't get sucked into trying to win the debate and beat all teams. Sometimes at closing, especially when you're in higher rooms and it's more competitive, you have to make strategic concessions and decide on the spot which team do you think you can beat and have the tools to beat, and which team you're going to relatively ignore or weaponize in order to beat the other teams. Does that make sense? So that there are instances sometimes where you have to get the first, and we'll talk about those instances, but usually don't get pressured to try and get the first. The second thing I want to note importantly is what sufficiency means, and how you prove your claims to sufficiency. And sufficiency, I think I'm going to explain this as an analogy to like 3v3 judging. And this is very controversial in terms of what sufficiency is. Judges have different ideas, debaters have different ideas. Here's my definition of the word and how that would play into strategic decisions, right? And your role as member. So in 3v3 judging, I'm sure there are instances where if you were judging as well, a speaker makes a claim that is so out of reality and unanalyzed at all, and no reasons as to why that might be true. We call them assertions, right? And even without a response from the other side, as a judge, I think personally, and I think many people agree, that it's fine to undervalue that point and say that point did not stand this debate as much because I can't see this point actually occurring to the extent that it's claimed. That means that individual, that team, has not proven that point to sufficiency, to a point that a general reasonable person would accept that point. Does that make sense? right? If you prove your point to sufficiency in any form of debating, that point should exist in the judge's mind as a reasonable, objective, average voter, whatever that means. You know, there are obviously discussions around what that means. And that means if the other team does not respond to that point, it should stand in the debate. But do you agree that there's some point at some point where you might not actually have a point, even if it's unresponded to, if it's not made well and substantiated well? Now, even if that is not necessarily the case all the time in 3v3, in BP, that's definitely the case. Because when you have 4 teams, so you have each team has 3 teams to take care of, the engagement between all those different points that are thrown around in the debate is very minimal, right? Because it's just hard in 7 minutes to engage with everything. So judges have a lot of work in deciding what stands in the debate and what doesn't stand in the debate. So sufficiency and whether points have been proven to sufficiency become very important. Why is this particularly important for you at member? I think I'll get into this later on, but just to flag it here, if you don't prove your point to sufficiency, right? And that means it's not fully substantiated at member, then if your whip speaker has to make that point properly, that in my mind is substantive contribution from whip, right? So especially op whip can't bring substantive contribution. Now, if you've proven your point is sufficiency and the judge is like, yeah, I can see that happening. Now the other side responds to that point and pokes holes in it and adds doubt to it. Now when whip comes and rebuilds the case, they are being responsive to those responses, right? So they're doing substantive stuff in rebuilding the case and, you know, challenging the questions raised by the other side, but that is responsive, right? So there is a fine line, it's relatively vague around what a whip can and cannot do. And the idea of sufficiency, having proved something sufficiently, is really important for that, right? Okay. And the final thing about BP in general is, like I said, you can't engage with every single point. You can't directly weigh every impact claimed and deal with every framework, because BP incentivizes, firstly, opening to be really broad, right? But also incentivizes closing to extend and do new things. So there's a lot going on in BP. And so debating in BP is less about dealing with individual arguments and responses, but more around the meta, around the point. So what does that point actually mean in comparison to other claims and other points from other people, right? So you need to talk about the points themselves and not just the analysis that goes into proving those points. Cool. Any questions on those 3 things? Yeah, that's basically literally, I think those are the 3 big tips that I would tell people about BP that I've learned the hard way, right? Your role at member, what should you do? I just put Zach Wong in there. Well, yeah, I did. It's Celine and Umbazar as well. But sorry, I just wanted Zach Wong. So. There's the cap. So this quote from Zach Wong in a very famous debate, probably Zach Wong's greatest moment. You want to add parts to victory for your team. You want to win. You want to provide a contribution, and you want to position that contribution. So here are your 3 roles as I see it, and they are ordered in this slide in order of importance and priority. So your primary role is to present and prove your extension to sufficiency, right? As I've already explained, what the whip can rebuild, otherwise it's new substantive. So that is your main role. If you don't do this, you're a bad member. So even if you have to spend 7 minutes just doing this, that's fine. If that is what it takes to prove it sufficiently, you should do it, right? Important. The second role you have is to position your extension. This is all the meta stuff we talked about, right? Not only proving the claim and the extension you're making, but you need to show that it's different from opening and sufficiently different enough so it's not like a derivative. But also then you need to show why that is so good and such a good contribution that it's going to beat the opening teams and most likely beat your closing. But obviously your whip can deal with closing and opening a little bit more, but you need to start putting it in the place of all the clashes that the judges so far thought of. And the final thing is to respond to anything that's left over. That's the least important thing, therefore the first to be cut, which means you do responses to extraneous things that don't include your extension after your extension in the last minute of your speech. never respond to generic points at the start, especially if you aren't that disciplined with debating, which I'm not. So I force myself to leave that until later. Only things that are relevant and tied directly to my extension and me positioning and proving my extension go up at the top. But that's obviously part of proving and positioning my extension. So it's not really individual responses, right? Clear? Cool. Okay. All right. Now members hard because it's very reactive. It's very vague and it's stressful. I like the stress, right? I like the adrenaline rush. But you don't know what you're going to be doing until the moment you do it, basically, right? So you need to be flexible. And so the stuff that you're doing prep and tracking, we're going to talk about how to be flexible, I guess, but also prepare yourself for your speech. So when you're prepping for closing, a couple of things. Firstly, be broad. You want to hit as many points as possible. You aren't trying, so in opening, you have a different, I guess, urgency to it, right? You want to be broad at the start at opening, maybe in the first 2-3 minutes. Think of all the different claims you can make, all the different points, and then you want to weed out the points that aren't going to stick and find the best points, the ones that are going to be the most important and last throughout the debate, but also you're weighing in 2 axes, the importance axis and provability axis. You want to find points that are provable as well. But in closing, you don't have the luxury of choosing which one to run. So you want to be broad for a longer period of time in prep and just don't go deep into the points, just the start point and the end point of points and some of the important mechanisms you'll need to prove that claim, and several of them. The second thing you want to do is to think positionally, right? So you want to think about how, okay, each of these points, how do they compare to each other? Are they affecting different stakeholders? Are they impacting people differently? And try and quantify and qualify what the different ways they engage with those things are, right? So if it's different stakeholders, think of reasons why one might be more important than the other, or vice versa, because you don't know which one you're going to be pushing over your opening. You want to do both sides. Similarly, for different, I guess, metrics and principles of what's more important, we should think about that as well, right? So for example, if the debate's about, and I'll use this as an example later on, there's a debate about whether we should have more dark themes in children's movies, right? So like, Lion King, which is like, killing your uncle, your brother, and then your father dies, and then, all that stuff, whether we should have more of that. There is an argument about how this might make people and children feel, right? In general, and whether dark themes are good or bad for their growth. And there's a secondary idea around whether that's on a group of children who've actually experienced that dark side, right? Because you have people who've lost their parents. What number of people have lost their parents? How do they interact? How are they made to feel if they aren't represented in those movies? Those are all discussions that you can think, and that'll help you position any potential extension you have. The third thing is, so positional thinking is for all those points. Now, the next is about extending inwards, right? Where you are going on the same lines as your opening, but you're going to do more and you're going to do better and actually claim those outcomes. The first thing is to look at the space around the points, right? So like I said, you have the start, end, and some mechanisms going to that. So check if there is an implicit starting point that is relatively obvious so that teams might miss that point. And that's overarching framework might be a place where you can extend inwards and claim more than your opening on the same idea and the same mechanism. So that's above, right? And then secondly, you can think below. Does that mechanism chain that leads to an outcome have any extra outcome to maybe more vulnerable people or maybe to a broader population? Is there that's like extending deeper, but also that same mechanism when applied to different contexts or a slightly different mechanism on the side could have outcomes as well that you could claim as new stuff that you are providing, even though that they've kind of proven the mechanism chain, you're branching off of it. So look at the space around the point, and that might give you ideas of where you can extend inwards. The final thing is obviously, there are obvious points in debates that you assume opening will take, and it's fine to assume that they'll take it, but don't completely ignore them. There are some cases where opening just misses obvious points, and you do want to have it written down in some way, and then you can make them. But also, as we'll get into when we look at extending inwards, think about what the opposition might say to that obvious point. Like, if there's an obvious point, there's an obvious response. Otherwise, then it's not a balanced debate, right? And ideally, the debates will be balanced most of the time. So think of the obvious response to that, and then think of the obvious clash. And if you think 3 steps ahead, you'll be probably able to think of, okay, how do we break this deadlock? How do we say, even if the opposition claim is true, how do we still win? And that also is a place where you can extend inwards. Does that make sense? Extend outwards, top 2 things in general, extend inwards. Any questions? No, I'm perfectly clear.
I just want to comment that Sam Trotter was briefly watching this live stream. So
shout out to Sam Trotter. It'll be useful this weekend. All right. How to track the debate. Okay, like I said, very tough. You need to do a lot in your member speech to distinguish. So tracking and listening to the opening half is mandatory. Use your partner as much as you can in terms of getting them to track as well to help you. But I don't know, bench talk is hard at the best of times. And especially when you're trying to write your extension, track the debate and do other things, it might be really tough to get input. So it depends on how you work best with whoever you're debating with. And so most of this, I would say, this is going to be assuming you're doing this by yourself, right? Your teammate isn't helping you, but obviously your teammate can help you and alleviate some of the burden that I'm about to discuss. So this is, again, my methodology on how I approach tracking debates as member. But try things out and you might find a better way of doing it. And that's why, practice debates are a good opportunity, even like practice tournaments that you aren't really competitive at. Good place to try new things. Okay, so in prep, basic skeleton of points. I usually just write on one piece of paper, start claims, blah, 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 usual stuff that we've discussed in previous seminars. And I leave a lot of space around it. As much as I can between points, right? Because I'm going to write stuff in between. Then on a separate piece of paper during the debate, I do the, they said, we say, kind of divide in the piece of paper, and I track what Prime Minister says, I track what Leader of Opposition says, and I try and write as specific as possible. Because I am going to need that language they use written down in my extensions to show why my extension is different from theirs, or more important, stuff like that, right? So you want to be as specific as possible to some points, right? There's obviously like fluff in debating you don't have to write down. As a judge, you also don't write that down, but it's good to have maybe direct quotes or like paraphrase, but the same language. That should be PMLO. Now, most of the class should happen in PMLO. You have to be careful though, because deputies will extend and try and burn. And one of my favorite strategies at DLO is just scorched earth, right? Where you like rattle through a bunch of points. If you're really efficient at doing this, you can completely screw over your closing. So you just need to be very careful that you're not missing that stuff. Here's probably where you like get your partner to kind of be an alarm and be like, oh shit, they said this word. Does that match with your points? But again, remember, just them saying the word isn't enough to take that point directly away from you. So again, it's specifically important to listen to what they exactly say. So then you can say, hey, judge, they only said this part of the point. They've missed this other part. But you can only do that if you've listened to that point specifically. However, after LOPM, that clash, you should know what the big points are. And then you need to pick the extension. So you'll be like, okay, this extension works. And maybe it's a slightly different one. Maybe you have to write a completely new one on the spot. That's fine. But have ideas of those extensions. If you have multiple of them, you can make the final decision of which one's going to win you the debate and focus on that later on, but start picking out the extensions. Obviously, they've said something, you can cross out the entire page. If you think it's not going to work, throw it away. What I do is, at that point, I start adding comments in red, and I'll obviously explain this when we go into extensions, but in the space I've left behind, I would write, OG says this in red or something like that, so that in my speech, when I'm going to be like, my point is going to prove X. Note that opening government talked about this in a very abstract sense. They said this, this, this. However, what they missed was this. And that's something I didn't have at the start, right? I added that onto the piece of paper because I heard opening government say that, and I decided, okay, that needs to be distinguished. I need to show why mine is different. And after that, you'll do the normal things we do in debating, which is just add analysis, add impacting, that kind of thing, forming your extension structure. Your intro shouldn't be formed until you've decided how you're going to extend. And then your introduction should be specifically about how your extension fits into the rest of the debate. So introductions could be, if it's a completely new extension, introducing that concept, introducing that context or new analysis or new idea about the debate. Or if your extension relies on a specific clash in opening, could be describing that clash in opening and being like, we break the deadlock because of this. Does that make sense? So your introduction shouldn't be a waste of time. It should be very short as well, because you need to get into the meat of your extension as soon as possible. Any questions about this? Again, it's really abstract because there are many, many ways that opening could like clash, and many ways that opening could also mess up. So you need to be quick on your feet at member. That's why I like member. I think it's one of the best positions in debating. Probably better than the second F, but second F is very similar to the kind of like putting clashes together and trying to form an extension, except you can't knife your first speaker, which is a shame. Okay. Any questions? No? Cool. All right. So before we get into just extensions in general, so I made this slide specifically about member, right? So specifically about what member has to do to provide extension material. There might be more to talk about extensions in general, like a specific, like what to do at closing seminar. This is not a what to do in closing seminar. It's more of a specific member seminar, but I'm happy within the discussion about extensions to take general questions about BP extending, right? So feel free to ask that if that is not already clear to you. And also at the end, we could do a little bit more discussion, or you can come talk to me later on. Cool. The three things that you have to have in every point you make at the start of the point, before you even make the point, but even within the points, is firstly, what did opening say? So be charitable, don't lie about it, but use framing and analysis instead. And to those who like lying in debating, this doesn't mean you can't lie about the world, which is, what, speak of the devil, look who walks in. Hey, Hops. I was just talking about how you shouldn't lie. Well, no, so again, you can lie about the world if that's the way you like debating, but don't lie about what opening said, because the judge should have tracked what opening said, right? So judge will be easily able to say, hey, no, actually they made this point. It's a complete lie that they didn't. Now, gaslighting in debating works a lot, and I've lost at opening, or I've come second to closing teams that just, falsely say, oh, they didn't make that point. Right? But that's why specifically at opening, and I'm sure people who did opening talk to you about this, you need to be very, very clear about what you're saying so that it can't be misconstrued by closing. So as closing, I would say, don't lie about what opening said. Try and specifically quote what they've said and frame that as being too narrow-minded, right? So you'd be like, they only talked about this aspect about the world. That unfortunately misses all of this other stuff. And I'll go into this later on. Part of that is explaining why you shouldn't implicitly agree, judge, that when you say we save poor people who are dying on the streets, and then you say, they talked about dying on the streets, but what about them dying in their own homes, right? That's obviously the same thing. You need to explain why specifically their claim ends at a certain point and why your claim goes beyond that, and that going beyond that is good enough a contribution to be counted as your own contribution. Tina, did you have a question? No. Okay. So once you've drawn the boundary around what opening has said, then you can clearly articulate where you are extending. But it's hard to do that without drawing that boundary first. And you explain, okay, once opening has done this, this is what they haven't done, and that is connected to our extension, or that is our extension. And then the final thing is very obvious stuff, which is impacting and weighing against the clashes and against the opening team. Here's what they tried to do. Here's where they stopped. Here's where I've extended. This extension is more important than that first step that they took, or whatever step that they took, for reasons, right? Likelihood, scale, intensity, very classic ones, but there are obviously a lot of ways to weigh. So any questions? So these three things should be in every single point you claim. You can have several extensions in member. I would advise not having too many. Two is good. You can have several extensions before your speech, right? Like you can have ideas of several extensions and written down several of them, but you have to don't, it's not, the sunk cost fallacy. You put a lot of work into this, but it might not win the debate. So just leave it and do the ones that you think are going to win. All right, so two forms of extending that we talk about. right? Extending outwards and extending inwards. I'm not going to do a lot of explaining about what these two mean in a general debating sense, just in terms of what you should do at member. So when opening have missed a point, very easy, just make that point and weigh it against other contributions. When opening have missed a context, slightly different, the context shift that you're making might have the same mechanisms that just interact with the world differently, right? So either the mechanisms that opening brought to you are actually stronger in the specific context, but you need to do the work. Don't just assume the judge is going to do that. Be like, in this new context, these mechanisms actually work much better for these reasons that opening didn't explain. Similarly, the responses from the opposition team might be weaker in those contexts, right? So an example, this house believes that communities should have like a veto power over building houses of worship in those communities, right? So government might say, yes, the community should have a veto because this would be bad in instances, it might increase like racial violence or something like that, right? If immigrant communities build grand houses of worship, the white community around them might feel bad and do other bad things towards minorities. That possibly is an argument that opening makes. Now, if you're saying, oh, actually, the context is different. It's not about immigrant communities building houses of worship. It's about, I don't know, Saudi Arabia funding Islamist schools in Indonesia to create more radicalization, or India building Hindu temples in Kashmir as a sign of oppression. That could be complete. It's a different context completely, right? The oppressor and the oppressed have been switched around a little bit in terms of who's building the houses of worship. And you can explain why there, the impacts are far greater and far more intense to those individuals. And the alternatives are also non-existent to a lot of those people, right? And so maybe if you shift that context, there are similar ideas on oppression and similar ideas on backlash, but you could be flipping it on its head and showing how it's more important. So that's very obvious stuff on extending outwards. In terms of extending outwards, usually it's hard to do if you have a good opening because the obvious and most important and provable arguments have been taken by them. So by nature, when you are extending outwards and bringing new ideas, those ideas are ones in a really good high competitive room, ones that the opening team thought weren't as useful or weren't as good to make at opening, right? In that instance, you will know then that there's one of two things you have to do. Either it's not as useful because it's hard to prove and you need to actually do a lot of work to prove it, or it's not as useful because it's not as important. And then you need to think, okay, I need to do a lot of impacting in a lot of specific way. Now, those things are things you do in general, but it's useful when opening is like deadlocked or mitigated, because you're not the only one in this debate trying to fight your opening. The opposition is also trying to fight your opening, right? So that's why it's important not just to track what your opening says, but what the other side's opening says and how those things interact. So, for example, the opposition will mitigate a lot of the benefits that your opening brought to you. They might say, it's not actually likely to happen for these reasons, or it's not mutually exclusive. Here are alternatives. So they're marginalizing either the likelihood of the outcome or the fact that the outcome is mutually exclusive to one side or not. Use that. Explain clearly why that interaction between the opening teams limits the contribution of the opening team. Our extension is fresh and new, and even if it's not as likely, and I've tried my hardest to prove analysis that it's likely to happen, or maybe it's not as important, but I've impacted hard enough, use that to compare against the mitigated version of the opening team. Yes, Tina, do you have a question? No. I'll give you an example where this goes wrong, right? You have to be very good. It requires good judgment. You need to be a good judge to do this because you need to be sure that mitigation and clash has actually happened and that your opening team hasn't won that clash. To be confident enough to say, hey, they've lost. We got this point, give it to us. There was I think it was a Logger Johnston a while ago, and I was at closing. It was about preventing, the people who talk to the dead. What are they called? Sorry? Mediums. Yeah. So it's about stopping mediums from charging for their for their services, right? And opening government said, yeah, we should stop them because they prey on individuals and have really high prices. And that's bad, right? So financially, they put people at risk. So the harm to individuals that go to mediums was that financial harm, and obviously tied to them having money, right? The opposition and OO tried to say, I was CG, by the way, the opening opposition tried to say, they don't charge that much. It's an easy market to enter to, so there are a lot of them, right? And because of the competition, they can't necessarily exorbitantly charge you. But secondly, if you do this, you will put a lot of these individuals out of business, right? Because they won't be able to make money now, and then they live on such small margins anyway. So the big characterization of the world is either there are a few of them that will never go out of business and make so much money, and we just prevent them from making money at all because you can't charge anymore, or there are a lot of them that can't charge that much, very small margins, and when they go out of business, then people don't have that, whatever catharsis of talking to their loved ones once or twice and then moving on. Clash happened. I wrongly assumed that opening opposition had beaten opening government. So when I started my speech as member, I was going to say our opening government tried to claim that there are financial harms to these individuals. Opening opposition rightly pointed these things out, and therefore opening government can't stand on those grounds. Right? Now, note, you can't knife your opening. So you can't make those responses to opening government. You have to use the responses that opening opposition made and explain why that beat opening government. And you do that very tactfully, so it's not a knife. So framing doesn't apply just to your points, but applies to the meta as well. Choose your words carefully. And so what I tried to do there then was say, okay, because of that, there obviously isn't a monetary problem here. Let me explain to you the psychological problem of how this stops people from getting over trauma, getting over loss, and harms to them on a emotional level, that kind of thing. But I called it wrong, which meant that opening government had beaten opening opposition, and because my entire extension was based on a wrong understanding of the debate, we also couldn't win. Right? If I'd called it differently, I'm not even sure what I would do. I'm not sure how I extend in that debate, but sometimes you make the wrong call, or you make a call, you try your best to try and convince the judges that opening opposition has won. Any questions on that? No? Cool. Like I said, it's very vague because there are many ways this could go down. The final thing is glass cannon extensions. Not really recommended unless absolutely necessary. Glass cannon extensions are extensions where when you have absolutely nothing else to say sometimes, or when you really, really need to take the first, you pick one of those things that has been left out that is not that provable or not that important, and try to prove it or try to prove it's important. It's called a glass cannon because either it fires and you come first, or it explodes in your face and you come fourth, right? Now, you might want to do this in the finals at closing when opening has completely screwed you over and you really need to win. I mean, coming second in the finals doesn't really matter. It's either first or nothing, right? So those instances. Maybe there are some instances when you're in the last round of the tournament and you really need the first, and opening has taken everything away from you. Like or you're relatively sure that a second isn't going to get you the break. Like you need the first, right? That's very rare because most of the time you have silent rounds and you don't know whether you're going to break or not. But don't do it. But there are instances where maybe you have to, or maybe you're just having fun and you like the argument, so you just do it anyway. All right. Let's go this quickly. Extending inwards, couple of things here. Sorry, I want to say one other form of extension before we go to extending inwards. There's responsive extensions, right? But I feel like that's extending inwards of a clash, where you pick the opposition's claim and you're saying, hey, the opposition have made this really good claim that opening hasn't beaten. That claim, and again, you use a good judgment here, that claim has outweighed my opening team. Because then that means opening opposition is winning at the moment. Right? Let's say I'm closing government. What I'm going to do is respond heavily to that opening opposition team and take that point out. What that means is not only do I respond to opening opposition's best claim, and I'm obviously weighing this up against some contribution I have, right? And if you try and flip opening opposition's claim, then that flip is a unique contribution that you have. So flipping or respond to the claim and say, okay, that means we beat opening opposition. Because without that contribution, without that response, opening opposition would have beaten opening government, that means we should come over opening garment as well, because we provided the crucial responses of the crucial flip. That means our side won. But remember, all these things I'm saying, you have to verbalize and be explicit about. Good judges might make that decision, but you can't rely on that. You need to explain it to them in plain words so that they will do it. Okay. Extending inwards. Firstly, strengthening analysis. This is again very reactive to the clash. So if the opposition has beaten your opening and it has to be real, you can't knife it. You can explain clearly why that response poked a hole in the entire case given by your opening. And therefore, the extension is fixing that hole, re-explaining certain things to unlock the benefits claimed by opening, right? Or to crystallize the benefits opening. There are many debating phrases that have popped up. You can make your own one. But the idea you're trying to say is without this extension, you aren't able to credit opening. So therefore, because you provided it, you should credit those outcomes and impacts to me. Right. I've already said that. Yeah, it responds to the rebuttal of the opening team. And if you redo the weighing here, that puts you above both opening teams. I think that's really useful sometimes, because then you can directly know after my member speech, I have beaten 2 teams. We're coming second anyway. Whip, it's all up to you to beat the other team and you come first. But you know, it's a good feeling sometimes you've taken off 2 teams out of the 3 just by your own speech. All right, expanding the analysis. This ties back to what we said during prep about looking around the points, right? You can expand broader by finding a common link between several mechs and impacts. What you need to do again, distinguish, isolate the implicit framing that opening missed, make that framing and explain why that lets you claim not just the stuff they were talking about and explain it better, but other stuff. An example of this, again, it's probably an internal, like Logo Johnson or something, which is like, this house prefers a world where people can't lie. And I was opening garment, and I said, oh, okay, here's like 5 different mechanisms, right? You know, firstly, people can't lie, which means people, the legal system gets better because people can't lie about doing bad stuff. Witnesses are more accurate, obviously, because, you know, you don't have the danger of a witness lying. Secondly, you have, I don't know, better relationships. People don't lie in relationship. You're better at this, you're better at that, you're better at that, right? Just discrete impacts that we were just pushing one after the other. Maybe not a good strategy. We should have done something broader. And then Daniel comes out of closing garment, and in his introduction is like, what opening garment characterizes are just discrete parts of the machinery of society that runs on trust. In a world without lies, we protect trust or something. And he made his entire speech about trust, and then showed how the mechanisms around how people trust each other in a very abstract, vague sense were basically the building blocks of all of our mechanisms of how we get, you know, better legal system, better this, better that, and then expanded it to like, it was like, look, this abstract claim and this mechanism of trust then lets us claim not just the benefits that they provide, but lots of other benefits of like international relations and society in general. Now, obviously, you need to be Daniel to make that point well. I don't think I could do that at closing, but it is a valid way of expanding broader by looking at the top level and then claiming a wide umbrella of other points. You can expand deeper by going to a more specific group that you claim is more important, like the debate I just discussed about darker themes in children's movies. You can talk about in general why exposing children to darker themes make them a better person, or like makes them kind of grapple with the future, right? They grapple with what's going to come. They will be in a situation where they're faced with death. If they're given the tools to understand how to deal with death by, like, you know, Bambi's mom dying, which was the example in the debate that I was checking, that means that they're able to be better in the future, right? Now, as a broad group of children, then I have this tiny weird benefit of maybe it helps them cope with death in the future if they ever deal with it. And there's like a pushback from the opposition saying, well, there are other ways to learn about death. Like, you know, schools can teach you about it. Why does it have to come from movies? And then the closing team said, okay, look, there's a much smaller subsection of children who we don't have to wait for the future for them to experience death. They've actually gone through it, right? They might be orphans or like a member of the family has died, something they've been close to. Those people get something very unique about those movies, right? So firstly, they say that, you know, makes them feel represented, that they can see the struggles of a character that they relate to because it's a children's movie. Therefore, they're able to actually deal with the stuff. They feel represented, not alone. Other children around them are also more like, you know, like okay with that idea. Like, oh, Bambi's mom died, or there's a Simba's dad died, that kind of thing. And so what they did was they explained why the same mechanism of like teaching people how to cope with things applies more deeply and more accurately and more immediately to a specific subset that it's more important. So that's going deeper, same mechanism, but deeper. Does that make sense? Hopefully those examples ground it. This pattern repeats in different debates, and you should find that pattern and verbalize it, and you'll get used to the meta and those words as you do debating, as you watch debates, those kinds of things. All right, Aisha, you don't have to do this. I can. It's fine. I can do it.
No, please don't. All right, Shar asked me to give a point for the opening so that you can practice extending inwards. Yeah. The motion is in disaster-prone areas. This house would replace all state rebuilding and reconstruction efforts with direct cash transfers to affected citizens. All right, I have 1 point. The context is that you live in a pretty bad place. It's disaster prone, and you probably want to move away because there's lots of disasters all the time. For example, if there's lots of earthquakes, maybe there's lots of liquefaction and your house is filled with sand. But moving is really expensive. How do we fix that problem? 2 things. Firstly, we give you the money to move, but through giving direct cash transfers to affected citizens so that you can buy a bus ticket, so that you can rent a new house and do all those things that are important for you to be able to move. You can only do that if you have money. But if you don't want to move, maybe, I don't know, you like the place or something, then we are still able to help those people. We give them the money to rebuild. We give them the money to buy shovels so they can take the sand out of their house. We give them money to put a wall up, etc., which means that we're able to help everyone. We help people who want to move and get them out. We help people who don't want to move, rebuild their homes. And we have 2 impacts. Firstly, we give them agency. It's important for people to have choice. And secondly, we give them much tangibly better outcomes. We get them away from a terrible area that is disaster prone and is ruining their life, and instead get them to a much nicer place. That's it.
Whoa. All right. Okay. So the claim that Aisha made at PM, and remember that this doesn't have to be like good. It's just demonstrating. No, we purposely made it bad. No, I know, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying we purposely made it bad so there would be holes that I could easily talk about. In fact, I've got an entire sheet on this. All right. So the idea is that people, more choice to people. We give them agency, and an implicit idea that's in this is that people are trapped in these areas due to a lack of means. Right. That was the implicit context that Aisha provided to you. That wasn't that built up. Right. It was assumed in her speech that people just can't move. If you give them money, they will move, and they don't want to stay in those areas, right? Or vast majority of people don't. So moving is expensive. We give them money to move. If they don't want to move, they can rebuild their house. Therefore, we provide agency and help people. Potential extensions inwards here is if the opposition says, well, actually moving isn't that hard, which means a couple of things. This money doesn't do anything unique for them, but also it challenges the implicit context of Aisha's case, which is that people are trapped. And Op is saying, look, people who wanted to move from this area have already left. It's not that hard to move. That means that the people that stay in these areas want to stay there. Now we're removing state help from them. So a place that you can extend inwards to show up, to I guess, fill in the gaps and make the point the opening was making and claim it as your own is say, and the words are important, right? Opening garment relied on the assumption that it's hard to move without actually substantiating it. Note that as opening opposition points out, if it's not that hard to move, that means that the entire case doesn't stand. And in fact, the people who want to move have moved already, which means it's actually a harm on their side. So if we can prove to you conclusively that it's really hard to move from place to place and that blah, 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 that means we unlock all the outcomes that opening said. And then you go into explaining why moving is hard. And obviously you come up with mix for that. That's up to you. The other thing is, what is Earth in this debate? I didn't change that slide. This is a last minute thing. Anyway, so the point is that also the idea is, Aisha was saying we give agency to people. We give them this money so they can rebuild their own home, right? the opposition is going to say, well, that's kind of a waste of money. If the state's going to rebuild that home anyway on our side of the house, and the state benefits from economies of scale or something like that, right? So if that is the clash, and you can see that's a different clash, it's like, who should be building the houses of people staying behind? So even if people are going to stay behind anyway, maybe a minority of people, even if it's a majority of people, why are direct cash transfers better than the economies of scale of the government? Can anyone give me an idea why? Why should people build their own homes as opposed to the government being charged? Even the government has economies of scale and can do it for maybe cheaper.
Well,
Yes, Grace.
They just have a certain taste. If you want their house to be pretty.
Okay, that's one reason. That's
Yeah. Standing on that, what if they really want to use their own kind of architecture?
okay. Okay, big, okay. Yes. Oh.
Expanding on that further, what if they're like, let's say they're Māori,
Okay.
and the government's all white, and then the government doesn't put any cool carvings into their home, and that was actually something really important to them.
Okay. So no, stop. No, I know. I'm no. Stop. I am going to help myself now. No, Harper has the right idea, in the sense that governments have their own ideology and preferences, and poorer people and minorities, etc., might not be given the same level of treatment in building that up, right? So people getting direct cash transfers puts the agency away from maybe corrupt, maybe lazy, maybe racist local governments that build their houses again. So all those are places you can see where certain patterns repeat themselves in your ability to extend inwards. That's it. Cool. Right on time. Any final, there are no final tricks and tips. Any final questions? And after that's done, we can get into the fun part, which is the AGM. Yes. These are debaters. The BP, this is one of them is member, one of them is whip, and it's a choose your own adventure. It's in black and white, so by definition. Oh, sorry, Melissa, yes. Okay, so the question for Melissa is how, as a whip speaker, how do you explain your extensions to member? I have actually very rarely gone whip. I usually go member, and I would say it's hard, and I think almost impossible to explain it in a short period of time, given that it's so reactive. So sometimes as whip, you kind of have to just trust your members' extension and go with it. Remember, you can't build extensions at whip. Like it's A, hard to do, B, sometimes illegal to do in debating rules. So sometimes you just have to go with what your member says. Sorry, yes.
My follow-up question is, given this honesty of data, what specific things do you try to break down those very great?
So in personal experience, being member with Daniel Wick, we usually agree on extensions after a while. We've debated together for quite a while, so we kind of understand each other's ideas and language. But if, let's say, I didn't understand something that Daniel wanted to talk about, he would explain to me at least the important parts of the argument that I could then, because I understood some parts of it, make an argument out of. And remember the point of sufficiency, right? If you can prove it to sufficiency in your speech, then Daniel can rebuild and create that point and weigh again. The impacting can be with weighing to weigh it up whenever he felt like. So as long as you can prove this sufficiency and you can communicate the sufficient mechanisms to your member, that point should be viable to run. But otherwise, that's the problem, right? If you try too hard as whip to push something onto your member and your member explains it badly, in BP, you can't fix it as much as you can at whip, because then you're adding new material. So it's not like 3v3. Every speech counts, especially member. You need to prove everything there. And that, again, going back to the slides around what your role is the fundamental role of whip. And with that, I will end this presentation. You can